以色列一劳永逸地摧毁哈马斯的愿望是完全可以理解的。该恐怖组织10月7日的袭击造成1300多名以色列人死亡，数千人受伤，约150名人质被劫持，其中大多数死伤或被劫持者是平民。这些袭击也提出了如何阻止哈马斯今后发动类似袭击的问题。但是，一个目标是可以理解的，并不意味着追求这个目标是最佳甚至可取的途径。以色列明显的战略在目的和手段上都存在缺陷。哈马斯既是一个组织，也是一个网络、一个运动和一种意识形态。它的领导层可以被杀死，但实体或类似实体将继续存在。以色列已开始对加沙进行空袭，而且有大量证据表明，它正准备进行大规模的陆地入侵，这让华盛顿陷入困境。拜登政府支持以色列采取报复行动的权利是正确的，但他仍必须设法决定报复行动如何展开。美国无法迫使以色列放弃大规模地面入侵，或在发动入侵后不久就减少入侵，但美国决策者可以，而且应该尝试。他们还应采取措施降低战争扩大的可能性。他们必须将目光投向危机之外，迫使以色列同行为巴勒斯坦人提供一条可行的和平建国之路。美国努力塑造以色列对危机及其后果的反应的理由，不仅仅在于现实，即朋友之间应该相互提出好的，但也是强硬的建议。美国在中东和中东以外地区的利益，既不会因为以色列入侵和占领加沙而得到很好的满足，也不会因为以色列的长期政策而给拒绝暴力的巴勒斯坦人带来任何希望。美国的这些目标肯定会带来艰难的对话和政治，但另一种选择，更广泛的战争和无限期的维持不可持续的现状将更加困难和危险。标题1：目的和手段。反对大规模入侵的第一个理由是，入侵的代价几乎肯定大于任何好处。哈马斯没有很好的军事目标，因为他已将其军事基础设施深深扎根于加沙的平民区。要摧毁哈马斯，就必须在人口稠密的城市环境中发动大规模进攻，这将使以色列付出高昂代价，并导致平民伤亡，从而引发巴勒斯坦人对哈马斯的支持。以色列也将遭受大量伤亡，更多士兵可能被绑架。如果要进行历史类比的话，那么美国在阿富汗和伊拉克的经历要比以色列在1967年和1973年的战争中所取得的成就更为接近。对加沙动用大规模武力，而不是对哈马斯采取更有针对性的行动，也会引起国际社会的强烈不满。以色列与阿拉伯政府，尤其是沙特阿拉伯的关系进一步正常化将受到阻碍，以色列与其阿拉伯邻国的现有关系将被搁置，甚至可能被逆转。大规模、旷日持久的军事行动还可能引发更广泛的地区战争，其导火索可能是真主党在伊朗的怂恿下有意识地决定向以色列发射火箭弹，也可能是约旦河西岸自发爆发的针对以色列人或长期与以色列保持和平的阿拉伯政府，尤其是约旦和埃及政府的暴力行为。拜登政府必须设法影响以色列的报复行动。即使以色列击溃了哈马斯，接下来又会怎样呢？没有替代当局可以取而代之。负责管理约旦河西岸的巴勒斯坦权力机构在加沙缺乏合法性、能力和地位。没有一个阿拉伯政府准备介入并承担加沙的责任。哈马斯或其傀儡很快就会出现，就像2005年以色列撤出加沙后发生的那样。这并不是说以色列不应该对哈马斯采取行动，恰恰相反，以色列必须这样做。与任何国家一样，以色列拥有自卫权，这使他可以打击已经袭击或准备袭击任何地方的恐怖分子。此外，以色列还必须向那些实施此类恐怖袭击的人展示他们必须付出的代价。然而，如何应对哈马斯的袭击，则是另一个问题。一个不同的选择是放弃大规模入侵和占领加沙，转而对哈马斯领导人和战斗人员实施有针对性的打击。哈马斯的军事潜力将被削弱，以色列军方和巴勒斯坦平民的伤亡将被控制在最低限度。以色列还应在与加沙接壤的边境地区重建军事能力，这将有助于恢复威慑力，降低未来恐怖袭击的可能性。 拜登政府与以色列政府和人民建立了巨大的友好关系，这得益于总统10月10日的非凡演讲、国务卿安东尼·布林肯上周对以色列的访问，以及向以色列提供其军事所需物资的决定。曾任纽约州州长的马里奥·科莫 （Mario Cuomo） 曾说过：“政治家用诗歌竞选，但用散文治理。”瞧，拜登总统的演讲是诗歌，但现在是散文的时候了，最好私下发表。美国和以色列都希望避免以色列在地区和全球的广泛谴责下被迫停火的结果。包括沙特阿拉伯在内的阿拉伯国家政府可以强化这一信息，帮助以色列释放人质，并向以色列表明，如果以色列被认为采取了负责任的行动，那么战争结束后，两国关系可以正常化。标题2：遏制战争。美国的第二个目标必须是阻止战争的扩大。最大的危险是拥有大约15万枚可打击以色列的火箭弹的真主党加入战争。要做到这一点，最好的办法还是说服以色列不要采取被广泛认为是滥杀无辜的大规模行动，因为这种行动可能会给真主党造成压力和借口。美国遏制真主党的能力有限，历史表明，以色列在黎巴嫩也没有好的选择。但华盛顿可以通过告知伊朗他将对真主党的行动负责来提供帮助，这就要求美国发出信号，如果真主党袭击以色列，美国准备给伊朗带来痛苦，比如减少伊朗的石油出口，现在每天约200万桶。由于这些石油大部分最终进入中国，美国决策者应考虑让中国同行知道，华盛顿准备通过制裁进口伊朗石油的国家，或在必要时攻击特定的伊朗生产或炼油设施，来阻止大部分石油贸易。中国政府可能准备利用其对伊朗的影响力，因为陷入困境的中国经济最不愿看到的就是能源成本飙升。华盛顿还应该无限期搁置进一步放松制裁的措施，并重申其在伊朗核计划问题上的容忍限度。迄今为止的报告显示，伊朗为哈马斯提供的是战略支持，而非战术支持，也就是说，伊朗多年来为哈马斯提供了培训、资金和武器，但目前尚无情报显示伊朗设计或下令了这一行动。几十年来，美国的政策一直是不区分恐怖分子和那些为其提供庇护、武器或金钱支持的国家。如果确定伊朗是哈马斯袭击的积极参与者，华盛顿将不得不考虑对其采取进一步的经济甚至军事行动。标题3：一国无解。如果尘埃落定，美国将有必要开展持续的外交活动，以恢复两国解决方案。美国政策制定者应该向以色列同行指出北爱尔兰的教训。上世纪90年代，英国在北爱尔兰的战略有2条轨道。在一条轨道上，英国政策的重点是建立大规模的安全存在，逮捕或杀害爱尔兰共和军临时部队和其他准军事组织的成员。英国的目标是发出信号，表明暴力将失败，爱尔兰共和军不可能用枪炮夺取政权。但英国政策最终取得成功的是第2条轨道，最终于1998年达成了耶稣受难日协议，或称贝尔法斯特协议，有效结束了长达30年的暴力冲突。这条路线为爱尔兰共和军领导人提供了参加严肃谈判的机会。谈判承诺，如果他们放弃暴力，就会得到他们所寻求的一些东西。英国的政策表明，他们在谈判桌上取得的成果要比在战场上取得的成果多。打这个比方，并不是说现在甚至很快就有可能恢复严肃谈判以结束巴以冲突，使外交时机成熟的必要条件明显不存在。哈马斯已经丧失了参与任何政治进程的资格，而且没有任何其他巴勒斯坦实体拥有妥协的政治力量。具有讽刺意味的是，哈马斯拥有妥协的政治力量，但却不愿意使用。巴勒斯坦权力机构过于软弱，不得人心。即使是亚希尔·阿拉法特等实力更强的巴勒斯坦权力机构领导人，在有更多机会的情况下，也对和平望而却步。以色列领导人也没有表现出更多认真谈判的意愿。在哈马斯发动袭击之前，本雅明·内塔尼亚胡总理的政府所奉行的政策破坏了真诚谈判的机会。他领导下的新团结政府是为了发动战争，而不是进行和平谈判。后者需要一个拥有新授权的新政府。即使以色列击溃了哈马斯， 接下来又会怎样呢？然而，如果试图在短期内进行谈判，将是徒劳的，甚至更糟。美国外交仍必须开始构建谈判环境的工作。涉及以色列和巴勒斯坦的政治轨道仍然至关重要。没有它，以色列与其阿拉伯邻国之间的进一步正常化将被证明是困难的，因为沙特阿拉伯现在比以前更有可能将以色列对巴勒斯坦人的政策作为正常化的条件。更重要的是，除非在不久的将来有一个巴勒斯坦国与以色列并存，否则以色列将无法继续成为一个安全、繁荣、民主的犹太国家。无限期的维持现状及所谓的一国不解决，会威胁到所有这些特性。美国应敦促以色列，首先是私下敦促，必要时再公开敦促，将其政策导向为一个可行的巴勒斯坦合作伙伴的出现创造条件。相比之下，以色列近年来的政策似乎有意破坏巴勒斯坦权力机构，以便能够说没有和平伙伴。我们的目标应该是证明哈马斯所提供的是一条死胡同，但同样重要的是，对于那些愿意摒弃暴力和接受以色列的人来说，还有更好的选择。这意味着要严格限制在约旦河西岸的定居点活动，阐明包括建立巴勒斯坦国在内的最终地位原则，并明确巴勒斯坦人为实现这一目标可以满足的严格但仍然合理的条件。要实现这一目标，华盛顿方面必须愿意积极参与这一进程，并公开表达美国的观点，即使这意味着美国要与以色列的政策保持距离。美国官员需要直接、坦诚地与以色列官员对话。奇怪的是，拜登政府对以色列司法改革和内部政治问题的反应，要比对以色列在巴勒斯坦问题上的态度强烈得多。但拜登政府需要与以色列进行只有美国、以色列最亲密的伙伴才能进行的对话。尽管拟议中的司法改革过去、现在对以色列的民主构成了重大威胁，但过去一周发生的事件表明，尚未解决的巴勒斯坦问题构成了更大的威胁。
观众朋友们好，感谢大家来到本期的思想先驱报节目现场。大家听我这个声音啊，不太的正常，的确啊是过去的一段时间啊，一直处于生病之中啊。今天呢，本来是回到了办公室，结果发现其实病还没有好，所以希望大家可以包涵一下啊。在刚才看到的这一段视频中呢，我们为您介绍的是最新发表在《外交事务》杂志上，来自外交关系委员会前主席理查德·哈斯的一篇文章。在这一篇文章中啊，哈斯先生就指出了美国在处理现在中东问题时面临的棘手复杂局面，到底加沙问题的出路何在呢？其实说到哈马斯这个词，那么大家呢可能会想到恐怖组织，而在这一篇文章中啊，理查德·哈斯先生就提出了，正是这样的一个组织，或者说是这样组织的复杂性，是美国在中东问题上面临乱局的一个关键。哈马斯既是组织，也是网络，同时也是运动和意识形态。或许一次打击行动，一次军事行动，可以将这个组织的头目干掉，但是类似的实体或者是实体会继续存在，而这呢，似乎是美国从几十年的中东战争中所得出的一个教训。现在有证据表明，以色列可能准备对于哈马斯以及其他区域武装进行大规模的陆地入侵。那么，白宫到底应该如何做呢？支持以色列采取报复行动吗？还是采取其他的方式重塑区域局势？而哈斯先生在这一篇文章中所提出的观点就是，作为美国总统，拜登应该做的并不仅仅是表示对于以色列的支持，还必须把目光投向危机之外，让以色列为巴勒斯坦人提供一条和平的建国之道。在这一篇文章中，哈斯先生表示，美国在中东和中东以外的利益 不会因为以色列占领加沙而得到满足，也不会因为以色列的长期政策给巴勒斯坦人带来任何希望。美国必须要接受艰难的对话，必须要接受政治上的挑战。相反的，其他选择更广泛的战争和无限期的维持这一种不可持续的现状，可能是更加困难，也是更加危险的。那么，面对现在的加沙局势，美国到底应该怎么做呢？哈斯先生认为，这比美国在阿富汗和伊拉克的经历，也比以色列在1967年战争和1973年的战争中所面对的情况更加的复杂。大规模、旷日持久的军事行动可能会引发广泛的地区战争，导火索有可能是伊朗怂恿下的黎巴嫩真主党，也有可能是约翰河西岸针对以色列人或长期与以色列保持和平的阿拉伯政府，特别是约旦和埃及政府的暴力行为。现在哈斯先生所提出的一个观点就是，并不是说以色列不应该对哈马斯采取行动，相反，以色列拥有自卫权，也必须这样做。以色列也必须向那些实施恐怖袭击的人展示他们必须负责的代价。但是，另外也是更重要的一点就是，以色列军方必须把巴勒斯坦平民的伤亡控制在最新限度，而同时，以色列也应该在与加沙接壤的边境地区重新恢复威慑力，而不是武力本身，以降低未来恐袭的可能性。拜登政府与前任政府不同，可以说与以色列政府和人民建立了相当好的友谊关系，并且与区域其他的重要军事力量以及美国的其他战略支点有比较稳定的联系。但是，如哈斯先生所言，引述纽约州前州长科莫曾经说过的一段话，说政治家在竞选的时候总是用诗歌，在治理的时候就是要用散文了。而在理查德·哈斯先生看来，不仅仅不是用诗歌的时候，现在这一篇散文也应该私下发表，通过私下谈判的形式，通过私下与以色列方面沟通的形式，为未来战争结束后两国关系的正常化设置合理的空间，不能滥杀无辜，也不能给区域其他恐怖力量造成进一步增加武力施压的压力和借口。那么，拜登总统到底应该怎样做呢？有关于理查德·哈斯先生的观点，就是美国最大的力量并不仅仅是为以色列提供支持，而是重塑区域和平道路的可能性，为未来区域的持久和平勾画一个可行的蓝图。何明先生怎么看的？
这篇文章当然是非常的重要啊！美国的这个国家呀，它总是会有一些智者的声音，总是有一些不同于大众的这种声音的这种独特的这种见解，而且呢，对情况的掌握的程度分寸也是拿捏得非常好。现在的中东的危机啊，我们现在有一个好的消息啊，虽然有很多糟糕的消息。好的消息就是把人道主义作为一个最大的公约数啊，作为一个最大的共识呢，似乎已经形成了。这也就是呢，西方国家啊，在支持以色列的时候，没有了简单的去悲愤啊，进行这个报复啊，不像911，也不像俄罗斯侵略乌克兰，因为大家从这个911之后的美国的行动和俄乌战争中得到了一些新的这个教训，而这一点呢，我认为是值得肯定的啊。那么包括以色列到现在为止都是相当的这个谨慎，没有那么的这个真正发挥出以色列的这个军事的这个力量。第二点就是呢，除了美国还有跟这个中东有那么深刻的这种利益、历史和宗教和很多因素的纠葛之外，那其他的国家相对来讲，它没有那么深的介入。欧洲啊，相对来讲比较轻松一点。俄国啊，也跟这个内塔尼亚胡以色列的总理进行了沟通，也愿意扮演某一种和平的角色。而中国在这方面有一些中国的朋友对这个中国的政府的立场啊有不满，听说以色列也有一些不满，但是整体来讲，以色列对中国在中东方面的立场，不是说今天才知道。 中国并没有从根本上，因为这一次就会简单的站在哈马斯一起跟这个以色列对立，没有啊。中国的角色和美国的角色和俄罗斯的角色和这些大国之间的表现，大部分都是求和啊，追求这个和平来解决问题，而且还有包括伊朗、包括黎巴嫩、包括约旦、叙利亚这个埃及这些国家，到现在为止，老百姓的情绪是比较高昂的，老百姓反应是比较强烈的。相比之下，政府还是比较谨慎。政府为什么会比较谨慎呢？就是第一，这些年实在是太长时间陷入了这个战争，影响了经济的发展，影响了跟世界文明的同步，而且付出太大的代价。没有几个国家真正愿意来参与这个战争。在最开始的时候，我就注意到了美国政府的态度对于伊朗来讲是比较谨慎的。后来的事实也到至今为止没有任何证据，伊朗虽然从战略上这篇文章讲的是支持这个哈马斯，但是从战术上并没有什么证据也就是说，只是在精神上、意识形态和历史背景来讲，这样的话呢，伊朗不参与。黎巴嫩也是这样，黎巴嫩大家看到了跟以色列的冲突其实是长期性的。在现在的情况之下，有没有升级到一定程度呢？现在为止还是算比较谨慎，因为黎巴嫩真主党它已经成为了政府的一体，它并没有一个完全不受控制的这么一个体系，所以中东的这个局势，老百姓的民意那当然是不一样，以色列的民众不一样，这个阿拉伯世界的民众也是不一样，但是政府之间还是到目前为止还是算这个理智，但是呢，总是会有一些意外的情况发生，像这个加沙医院的这么多人的伤亡，昨天我就真的是很长时间都不想讲话，都不想就是讨论什么事情，因为几百个位在医院的人就这么突然之间1秒钟就没有了。那么，但是现在谁是责任者？昨天还有网友说，你们应该谴责，其实不是谴责的问题，其实我们连最起码的事实都没有搞清楚，悲愤。
说到这一点呢，我们请导播放出这一张图片《纽约时报》昨天在有关于加沙事件的报道中一篇文章是连续换了3个标题，为什么呢？因为大家对于整个事件的了解也是在不断的进化中最开始是说以色列袭击加沙医院造成了500人死亡然后呢是变成加沙医院被袭击造成了500人死亡，第3呢是加沙医院出现了500人的伤亡问题，因为现在不知道到底是袭击还是一枚发射的导弹因为误袭导致的情况。那么最新的情况呢是拜登总统刚才我注意到那么呢他呢是表示，我之所以得到这样的信息，就是肇事者不是以色列，这是来自于国防部给我的通告。而美国国家安全委员会的发言人随即出来澄清说现在美国方面对于有关事态的了解还在不断的进行当中，但是根据我们目前所掌握的情况，没有证据表明这是以色列的所为所以这也显示出了，即使是我们最专业的媒体同行，在遇到这样突发大事，在遇到这样一个复杂局面的时候，在处理新闻事实的时候，可能也会出现好几轮的修正那这呢，就是我们请导播拿出来的这一张《纽约时报》昨天同样一篇文章的3个版本。最开始是以色列袭击，然后呢是至少500人死亡，出现了袭击，但是去掉了以色列，然后呢是至少500人死亡，加沙医院发生爆炸，去掉了袭击这样的一个过程。我觉得呢，我们的观众也对我们多一些耐心，我们也在对事实进行不断的探寻，同时呢也为大家提供我们所掌握的第一手信息。实在变得太快，如果我们为大家介绍的情况后来被发现是错误的，或者是被更新的证据所否定，我想呢也希望观众朋友们能够理解我们诚实在第一时间为大家报道的用意但是说到这个以色列和美国的问题，就涉及到了我们今天要谈的另外一个更广泛的话题，就是外交关系中的敌友关系有的时候我们说美国是以色列最亲密的伙伴，但是美国在以色列问题上现在表现的支持的立场，反而是得到了美国其他一些盟友的某一种这个不理解或者是不支持，甚至有很多美国自己人也认为在这样的一个问题上，美国过早过快的导向了以色列的立场，而没有考虑到区域内加沙民众以及巴勒斯坦民众，包括更广泛整个阿拉伯世界对于以色列与美国不同的看法。 这呀也是理查德·哈斯先生在文章中所提出的一个观点，就是美国是以色列最亲密的伙伴，但这并不意味着拜登政府必须要对以色列的一系列作为进行100%无条件的支持。拜登政府真正需要利用这一对伙伴关系做的是什么呢？就是要与以色列政府进行只有美国才能够进行的对话。这不仅仅包括以色列在司法改革倒退中所出现的问题，以色列民主出现的各种各样的危局，以及对于内塔尼亚胡政府执政对于整个以色列社会造成的破坏，美国可以进行施压，包括对于重构以色列在区域内的生活环境以及区域内更持久的和平，美国其实有比其他国家更大的话语权，而这才是美国真正的力量所在。哈斯先生在文章中也提出了一个可能具有一些争议性的观点：持久的和平从来不是在战场上解决的，而是在谈判桌上实现的。这里呢，他举的例子是爱尔兰革命军当时呢，英国最开始是希望通过战争的方式对于爱尔兰革命军进行镇压，但是后来我们也知道受难日协定其实呢是以谈判和让步的形式对于整个危局进行了相关的化解，而达成了几十年虽然不稳定的和平那么有关于敌友，有关于所谓的无上限的伙伴关系，其实呢不仅仅是拜登有这样的情况，有这样的困局自己的盟友出了问题到底怎么办？近期习近平和普京，中国和俄罗斯之间的盟友关系也成为了很多中国政策问题观察专家的重点。到底应该怎样处理敌友之间的关系？孰敌孰友，在国际关系上到底应该如何看呢？而说到这个话题，今天早上有一条非常有趣的新闻，普京宣布已经接受了越南方面的邀请，将在晚些时候对于越南正式进行国事访问，而同时泰国方面也向普京提出了相应的邀请。说到越南这个国家近期我们也经常提到是不是中国加一最大的得益一方？但是我们也为大家介绍到了越南这个国家在处理国际复杂关系的时候，它的某一种灵活性或者是平衡性。美国总统刚刚升级的与越南的伙伴关系，似乎呢是有把越南拉入自己前庭后院阵营之意。结果马上习近平就要对越南进行空前盛大的国事访问，而且就安排在预定11月赴美进行 APEC 会谈的前夕，显然呢是为了重塑与美国的谈判局势，达成某一种有利条件的这样的一招。结果在国际上在国际法庭被追究的这一位战争罪犯普京，由于在俄乌战场的种种作为，现在居然也是受到了这一个亚洲国家的邀请，这到底反映了越南的什么样的特点，或者更广泛的而言，反映了国际关系的什么样的特点？洪先生，
现在的全球南方国家尤其是这些发展中国家都有一个共同的这种心愿，就是要把自己变成一个经济发展的国家政治上放在其次的位置上，首先要把经济发展起来。那经济发展起来，中国有一句再通俗的话叫和气生财，跟各方面都尽量去避免产生这种无谓的这种口水或者是其他方面的冲突。所以我们看到过去阿拉伯的国家这个中东之所以看出这个希望出来，就是阿拉伯一些世界的国家也开始类似像这个越南或者印尼这些国家一样的，跟各个方面各个大国之间都保持某一种关系。通过这种关系不仅是简单是一个平衡，就是希望通过这种关系来合适于自己的这个发展。所以越南是这样，印尼是这样，其实印度也是这个样子马来西亚、新加坡那么这个巴西、阿根廷，虽然阿根廷好像是这几天马上就要选举了吧，有这种右存的可能性，但是就算是这样，也不会维持多长时间。真正的主调已经产生了，那就是呢不能让国际局势再重新发挥正音，不能让国际局势再变成一个黑白的两个体系，不能让国际局势变成了孤立制裁、战争对抗的这些游戏中间。所以这是越南的一个高超的，同时也是非常务实的一个外交技巧，同时呢它也不是孤立的。
好，谢谢何明先生继续讲吗？
不用讲了啊，要讲的话讲他涨了。
好，那么今天啊，有关于这个拜登与习近平外交的前庭后院，我们就为您介绍到这里。但是啊，随着“一带一路”论坛的召开，随着即将进行的 APEC 峰会，以及现在正在进行的中东危局的化解，我们也希望我们的观众朋友们目光啊，不仅仅要集中在某一个国家，与另外一个国家之间这样点对点的双边关系上。其实呢，国际关系有很多的层次，又是多线程、多层面的，有的时候呢，了解起来既复杂，同时也是乐趣无穷。而这样的观点和这样的思维方式，正是我们在思想先驱报这一档节目中希望为大家带来的。以上就是本期思想先驱报的全部内容。下周三同一时间，我们与大家再会。同时，不要忘了继续关注华尔街电视以及我们今日华尔街的其他相关节目。
以色列一劳永逸地摧毁哈马斯的愿望是完全可以理解的。该恐怖组织10月7日的袭击造成1300多名以色列人死亡，数千人受伤，约150名人质被劫持，其中大多数死伤或被劫持者是平民。这些袭击也提出了如何阻止哈马斯今后发动类似袭击的问题。但是，一个目标是可以理解的，并不。
Andrew Schwartz said, "Thanks very much, Josh. And welcome to CISA's press briefing. We'd like to offer you today our latest insights on the Israel-Hamas war and all the challenges surrounding what's happening right now for Israel and for the Palestinians. We have a terrific lineup of my colleagues. We're going to lead off with Dr. John Alterman, who's Senior Vice President at CISA, Zbigniew Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy, and Director of our Middle East program. John is going to deliver some remarks. We're going to go down the order after John, and then we'll open it up to your questions. John, take it away. John B. Alterman said, "Thanks very much, Andrew. Thank you all for joining the call. The images of the last several days have been wrenching. And like you, I'm bracing myself for the weeks to come. We think we know the script: a ground invasion, high civilian casualties, weeks of fighting, and an eventual Israeli victory. I'm not confident it's all going to go according to the script. Hamas has departed from the script that Israel assigned it for years last Saturday, and last Saturday was surely only the first act that Hamas had planned. They knew it was going to be followed by airstrikes and a ground invasion. They arguably have been preparing for an Israeli ground invasion in Gaza for 15 years. What other surprises do they have planned? How successful will they be? And after Saturday, we should have humility about how much we understand about Hamas, its capabilities, and its planning. While Hezbollah isn't looking to fully enter this war in my judgment, it's also preparing to. My assessment is they'd like their contribution to be limited to distracting Israel and drawing resources to the north, but I can certainly see circumstances where Hezbollah is drawn into full-scale conflict. And that would have devastating impacts on both Israel and Lebanon. Just this morning, I was reviewing Fred Ickel's book Every War Must End, and I think it's a book that a lot of people should be picking up this week. As the war starts, we need to pay attention to the piece of how this war is going to end. I had a piece in Time magazine yesterday that argued that the winners and losers of this conflict are going to be determined less by the fighting than the aftermath, and the fighting isn't a satisfactory outcome by itself, it needs to create leverage to obtain the desired outcomes. There is going to be a role for diplomacy here, and Arab states in particular may play an important role helping create a better post-war reality and legitimating it, and we need to start paying attention to that potential role now. Before that happens, there's going to be a lot of fighting. A lot of people are going to die in the next week. This may be the most transparent war the world has ever seen. We've already seen social media explode with images. I'm afraid that next week it's going to be full of clips of mutilated bodies and unspeakable horrors. Disinformation and propaganda are always part of warfare, but our media consumption habits are going to completely supercharge this. People are going to feel completely informed when they're only getting a sliver of truth, and the resultant polarization is going to be supercharged, too. As I see it, when the fighting dies down, Israel is going to be dealing with two simultaneous problems. It's going to be dealing with political battles about accountability for the failures that led up to this war and political discussions about what an acceptable outcome with the Palestinians might be and what should be pursued. That's going to be very hard to do, and one of these political battles can undermine the other, but both are really vital discussions. I think that's going to be where we are in the winter, and it's going to be tough to disentangle. The Israeli writer David Grossman had an important piece in the Financial Times today asking what Israel will be after this was over, and he writes, quote, "If I may hazard a guess, Israel after the war will be much more right-wing, militant, and racist. The war forced on it will have cemented the most extreme hateful stereotypes and prejudices that frame and will continue to frame all the more robustly Israeli identity. I'd argue that's not inevitable. It might not even be likely. But for Israel supporters in the United States and around the world, and for Palestinians as well, that will be a very difficult outcome if it comes to pass, and all of those outside parties have an interest in trying to ensure that it does not." Why don't I end my comments there, and I'd be happy to add comments after all of my other colleagues have spoken. Thanks very much, Andrew. Mr. Schwartz said, "John, thanks very much." And next I'd like to introduce Dr. Seth Jones, who is the Senior Vice President at SAIS. He's our Harold Brown Chair and Director of the International Security Program here at SAIS. Seth, the floor is yours. Seth G. Jones said, "Thanks, Andrew." Thanks, John. Great to be on what is an all-star panel, and an honor to be on it. Let me just briefly touch on one military and one political issue, and I'll try to be brief and leave room for the discussion. Israel has announced that its military objective is to destroy Hamas, largely, with its political and military leadership dead, captured, or underground, and much of its infrastructure and weapons demolished. I'm skeptical that Israel will be able to destroy Hamas for reasons I'm happy to get into. Nevertheless, that for Israel to accomplish these objectives, or at least to attempt to, I don't see any other viable option, than an occupation of Gaza, and I'll get into more details, some of the complications on that in a moment. That occupation, whatever it looks like, certainly going to be costly to Israel. A range of us have been looking at and have been over to Israel, including recently to look at Cast Lead, Operation Pillar of Defense, Operation Protective Edge, and a number of other Israeli operations in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon. I was there just recently during Israeli operations against Hamas and others in Jenin back in June and July. But this war is going to be different for a number of reasons. I think we have already seen the beginnings of the Israeli Operation Blanket in Gaza, with ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, seeking information house to house, floor by floor, operational awareness. The challenge, I think, one intelligence challenge is going to be, for anybody involved in urban combat, whether it's been in Fallujah or anybody that spent time, on the ground in Gaza or the West Bank, is distinguishing terrorists and their support network from civilians, which is very difficult in an urban environment. I mean, IDF soldiers have extraordinary competence in operations in both the West Bank and Gaza, and, obviously, up north in Lebanon. But when you're facing extraordinary stress, Hamas and other militants and civilians trying to kill you in a densely packed urban environment and have to make very quick decisions with your finger on the trigger with imperfect information, it's going to lead to civilian casualties. So I think we should expect that. Israeli operations will also include, in addition to those ground forces, dismounted infantry, armored personnel carriers, because you need those to bring in forces, the Merkava tanks, and bulldozers, which they have traditionally used for ground operation. We've already seen them using fixed-wing aircraft, the F-16 and F-15s, among others, attack drones, such as the Hermes 450 and the Heron 900, and then helicopters. So, there's a little bit of the military objective, the kinds of capabilities they're going to use. I'm happy to get into the difficulties of the urban environment in Gaza, which are complex. But I just want to end on a brief comment on the challenge of what to do when major combat operations start to wind down, because they will at some point, and the big question for me is, what will law and order look like, in some capacity, in Gaza? Clearly, the Israelis aren't going to be able to trust Hamas, Islamic Jihad, or any of the groups on the ground. The Palestinian Authority has next to no legitimacy, particularly in Gaza, and has shown very little competence in governing. So this raises the prospect of some temporary solution to an occupation of Gaza, checkpoints, monitoring population movement, conducting occasional raids, and trying to build a much more robust and heavily mined border between Gaza and Israel. But as Clausewitz reminds us, war is a continuation of policy by other means, and I just end this, and happy to get into this. I think there are some huge questions about what the next step is for some at least temporary law and order and governance of Gaza, which will be a very, very delicate and difficult decision-making process. Hand it back to Andrew. Mr. Schwartz said, "Seth, thank you very much. Now I'd like to introduce Mr. Norman Rule, who is non-resident senior advisor with the SISE Transnational Threats Project. Mr. Rule is a former senior U.S. intelligence official, having served for 34 years in the CIA managing significant programs relating to the Middle East. Mr. Rule, the floor is yours." Mr. Rule said, "Great. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you and to be a part of such an august group of individuals. I'd like to speak about Iran, specifically, briefly, two issues. First, what are Iran's goals in this war, and what role has Iran played leading up to this, and what are the most likely wildcards or significant wildcards we should consider? Iran's goals range from the obvious, deleting Israel, damaging rapprochement with the Arabs, but also it goes beyond that. Iran would hope that Israel is involved in a long-term conflict because this erodes Israel's public credibility in a region where Gulf Arabs and others are increasingly comfortable in dealing with Israelis. This conflict also has the potential of drawing in the United States, and that brings about the same benefit if the United States, like Israel, can be seen as involved in producing significant Palestinian civilian casualties, that erodes the confidence, trust of the United States and creates problems in the street. Iran is seeking to project power in the region as a way of demonstrating once again, to all of its neighbors, it needs to be taken seriously, it can't be ignored, and its equities and demands in the region will need to be given respect and engaged. Iran is also seeking to inject itself into great power issues. As this moves forward, you can see Iran playing a role, for example, on hostage issues. There are a variety of different nationalities involved in the hostage crisis, and it is not unlikely, and indeed almost certain, that some of them will go directly to Iran to say, "What can you do to assist in the recovery of my personnel?" I would look at China, for example, as being something there. Iran is also going to shape its proxies in the region with their behavior. Iraq is obviously going to be of concern to the United States as to how they deal with proxies in Iraq and in Syria and what that means for our counter-ISIS operations, embassy operations, and protection of our forces. If I had to point to a wildcard involving proxies that I believe is the most dangerous, and indeed, in the coming weeks perhaps the most likely significant disruptor involving proxies that would touch multiple global equities, it's actually the Houthis. So here is the scenario. The Houthis fire a medium-range ballistic missile at Israel. The Houthis launch 2 attack drones against Israel. Who responds? How much time and energy does Israel spend on this? Does the United States involve itself in suppressing Houthi activities? What if the Houthis undertake activities against Israel-related shipping in the Red Sea? Imagine what this would do to oil prices, insurance prices, cargo costs in a Red Sea economic basin that carries approximately 20% of the world's container activity, a fair amount of its oil depending upon everyday's flows, as well as foodstuffs, etc., etc.? That would touch the U.S. economy as well as other economies. So what has been Iran's role in this? Well, it's actually quite profound and limited. There's been a lot of discussion about what did Iran know and did it give permission and what is it doing? That's not how Iran works. The way Iran works is it goes into a geography. It identifies a promising arsonist, it then empowers, trains, and resources that arsonist to dominate all the other arsonists in its area, in that geography, and then it gives that arsonist very specific matches. These tools in Iraq were the explosively formed projectiles, the improvised rocket-assisted munitions, the IRAMs. In Yemen, they were ballistic missiles and they were drones. And with Hamas, it is relatively small-caliber missiles and rockets, although the FAR-5s are serious, drones, and a capacity to develop weapons indigenously in underground weapons factories. Iran provides actually very little intelligence support because it's not needed. The local actors take their capabilities and apply that to their own intelligence collection. so in this case, Hamas could see the observation towers. Hamas would know through Google Earth where a storage facility was located. And they conducted various attacks. The rocket, the Hamas fires are generally relatively inaccurate and are aimed at city centers and not necessarily specific Israeli locations. And of course, the multiple terrorists who came across the border were not terrifically sophisticated, they were just armed with assault weapons and told kill any civilian and bring anyone you can bring back. For Iran, they're going to Project Defiance. They're going to try to compel the Saudis and others to stay close to the Arab Street and to criticize and to stay away from Israel. The Iranians are also going to highly propagandize any civilian losses to raise the tension of the Arab Street in essence, because it does constrain the activity of Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and others. It is likely that Iran is going to seek some sort of regional conference or some sort of regional effort to handle the day after, if only because that once again puts Iran in the center of all its activities. There will be countries looking to Iran in coming days to see what it can do. That will encourage Iranian negative behavior more than Iranian positive behavior. The Raisi regime has propagated an assertive and at times aggressive foreign policy. It's seeking to demonstrate right now, as Iran goes through the beginning stages of what would be its leadership transition to a post-Khamenei era, that this current policy can achieve strategic gains. I'll stop there for other, smarter people. Thank you. Mr. Schwartz said, "Thanks very much, Norman." Next up, we have Dr. Daniel Byman, who's a senior fellow in our Transnational Threats program. Dan, the floor is yours. Daniel Byman said, "Let me talk about two different issues that my colleagues did not address in depth. The first is hostages. This is an off-the-chart number of hostages that Hamas has taken. In the past, we've seen limited operations where they've captured a soldier, or we've seen Hezbollah capture soldiers who were wounded and then died, and Israel has done mass exchanges of Palestinian prisoners for these, in the one case, over 1,000 prisoners for one hostage. And here you have 150, and this is going to pose multiple challenges in the days to come. First of all, there's an immediate tactical challenge. These hostages will be dispersed and some will probably be held in tunnels underneath Gaza. And when Israel goes after the tunnel network as part of a military campaign that Seth talked about, it has to worry that it's going to put the hostages at risk. In the past, that would have been an absolute no-no, that Israel was incredibly sensitive on this issue. However, it's possible the rules have changed on this and Israel is simply saying, this is a war, hostages will happen, and we're not going to have military operations deterred by them. The second point, though, is strategic use of the hostages. Hamas has threatened to execute them in response to Israeli military operations. So far, thankfully, that's been an empty threat as Israeli bombing has only grown and Hamas has not done so. But the closer Israel gets to succeeding in many of its goals, the more it hurts Hamas, the more it goes after its leadership, the greater risk is that Hamas will respond by executing hostages. And I would stress that these are not only Israeli hostages, but they also involve nationals of other countries, the United States, France, other major powers. So in contrast to past crises where the United States' involvement was very much about supporting a close ally, this time the United States has its own people that are in the crosshairs. The second point I want to go into a bit more detail on is the Lebanese Hezbollah. John mentioned that for now they are trying to walk a line with some symbolic strikes but not become fully engaged, and I strongly agree with that. I want to talk about Hezbollah's calculus in all this. Hezbollah has reasons to be cautious. Although it's a very effective military force, although it has 10 times as many rockets and missiles as it did when it fought Israel very effectively in 2006, it has to worry about the Israeli response. When it fought Israel in the past, there was devastation in Lebanon and this was unpopular among ordinary Lebanese. It hurt the group with some of the communities, but it also caused tremendous pain to Hezbollah's own constituents. And Israel has made it clear in the intervening 17 years that it will follow this playbook but be even more destructive. And this is something that Hezbollah has been very careful of, and as a result it's been very calibrated uses of force that involve limited attacks on areas that Hezbollah has considered under dispute, inaudible, other operations that show some degree of support for Hamas but don't cross red lines. But there are some caveats. Caveat number 1 is that military force can easily get out of control. And at a time when Israeli especially is incredibly sensitive, it's quite easy to imagine circumstances where an operation that Hezbollah thought was not going to be that provocative escalates. And this happened in 2006, where Hezbollah did a kidnapping that it thought was simply part of the rules of the game, where Israel felt it was a cause for escalation. But also, the media consumption that John mentioned comes into play here. If any of you watch or listen to Arab media, it's an incredibly different news guide. And the bombing of Gaza, the clear deaths of innocents there, of children, of older Gazans, and that's going to be in constant play. And as a result, there is going to be pressure on all regional actors to stand up for Israel. And for some there may be pressure for more diplomatic actions, but for Hezbollah it's going to be pressure for military action. And then add to all this the Iranian context. I think Iran sees this as a success. It stirred the pot. It disrupted the Israel-Saudi normalization. But Iran may have its own reasons to try to further escalate this. So there are question marks on this, and I do hope it can be contained. But to me, this is very much watch this space, because things could change in the coming weeks. Mr. Schwartz said, Dan, thanks very much. And we also have Ms. Emily Harding, who's here with us. She's Deputy Director, Senior Fellow of the International Security Program at SAIS, and with an extensive intelligence background and leading a new project on Intel here at SAIS. Emily, the floor is yours. Emily Harding said, thanks so much, Andrew. Intel failures like this one are never just one thing. They're like a plane crash. It's a whole bunch of little things that go wrong that all add up to a huge disaster. So I'm going to go through a few points on how this intelligence failure happened from what we know right now and then looking ahead. So, first of all, from what we know now we can group the problem into 3 buckets. Number 1, a collection failure, number 2, an analytical failure, and number 3, a tactical warning failure. On the collection front, for Israel, Hamas, Iran, and Hezbollah are all top collection targets. They have long contributed lots of resources. A high priority to collecting on those topics. However, these adversaries have been after each other for a very long time. At this point, they can pretty much anticipate each other's moves, and maybe it seems like collection has gotten more difficult in recent years. Gaza, southern Lebanon where Hezbollah is based, and Iran are all reasonably closed societies, so handling human assets gets harder in a closed society. In addition, Hamas seems to have conducted a denial and deception campaign in the run-up to this invasion of Israel. One thing that we saw was that Hamas leaders were speaking on a line they knew Israel had tapped to talk about how they had absolutely no interest right now in engaging in any kind of massive operations, and that seems to have worked. The Israeli analysts seem to have actually accepted that as true. Also, I really question whether Iran's recent capability advancements in the cyber sector have translated over to Hamas. As we know, Israel is one of the most sophisticated actors in the world when it comes to cyber activity. They are virtually unparalleled when it comes to the capability of doing things like hacking into cell phones, hacking computer network operations, and hacking into systems. Iran has gotten much better both at cyber offense and defense, and I am questioning whether or not Iran may have provided some of that assistance to Hamas in order to help them boot Israel off their networks in recent months. Again, this is just speculation. I haven't seen any indication of that. But it kind of fits with the pattern that we just saw. So that's the collection challenge. On the analytical challenge, some news pieces have come out lately suggesting that Israeli analysts were briefing the Israeli National Security Establishment in recent weeks that they thought Hamas was deterred. This is the kind of thing that we see where there's a failure of imagination. The Israeli analysts may not have been able to imagine a massive multi-front attack like this. They did see indications that Hamas and PIJ, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, were training and in fact training things like assaults on settlements, but they dismissed those as exercises. Third, we have this issue of tactical warning. The New York Times piece that came out a few days ago was really excellent and laid out how some of these pieces had come together to create this disaster. First of all, we know that the Israeli intelligence saw the surge of fighters towards the border and flagged it for border patrols. But what we don't know is whether those warnings were not heard, not acted on, whether the holiday played a role. But for whatever reason, the border guards did not respond in an appropriate manner. Number 2, Hamas used drones to take out the cell towers that were around the border wall, and that had several effects. One question that I will have, going forward, is whether or not these were Iranian drones like the ones that we have seen pop up in Ukraine. But the effects were that when they blinded the cell towers, they blinded the cameras that were along the top of the wall, and that prevented Israel from having situational awareness of what was happening where. The second thing that did was disabled some of the remotely controlled guns that are on top of the wall. Those weapons would have been able to push back the people who were, for example, using bulldozers to push down sections of the border and cross on foot. Those were disabled when the cell towers were gone. And then number 3, it seems to have really harmed the IDS command and control efforts. There was no way to really organize a rapid response. So, yes, this was an intelligence failure on multiple levels. I'm sure that when the conflict starts to wind down, as Seth was discussing, there will be lots of internal questions about what went wrong. But for right now, Israel is facing a different huge intelligence challenge, and that's, number 1, finding the hostages. They're going to be doing everything they can to pick up any indication that a group of hostages is, hiding here or scattered here. And the other piece is to find Hamas, trying to separate out the citizens of Gaza, the non-combatants, from Hamas and Islamic Jihad, the people who are actually the combatants, and then organizing their ground offensive that way. I published a commentary a few days ago on SI's website laying out this intelligence failure argument in much more detail if you're curious. I also just wanted to focus on, 2 additional things. Dan mentioned that the Arab news is very different than some of the news coverage we're getting in the US. I'm in Europe right now, and I wanted to point out that a lot of the European news is also different than what we're seeing in the US. I flipped on the TV in my hotel room and Euronews came up, and it was all focused on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, with a lot of these horrific images that people are talking about with nothing from the Israeli perspective. Another thing that's being talked about on European news is the potential for anti-Semitic attacks in some of the cities. Like, in London, for example, I know there was some anti-Semitic graffiti and some attacks on some kosher grocery stores and things. Finally, the other thing that I wanted to flag is that there's a Washington Post piece out right now that talks about Hezbollah, and it cites a Joint Chief of Staff intel assessment from February, one of the pieces that was in the Discord leaks. And the main thrust of the Post piece is that Hezbollah is probably going to stay quiet, that the intelligence community, the U.S. intelligence community, assesses that Hezbollah is mostly deterred from attacking Israel right now. 2 things to point out about that. Number 1, it's old, it's from February. And number 2, the information in that assessment is labeled FGISR. That means foreign government information from Israel. So a lot of that assessment, the information in that assessment anyway, is going to be based on information that Israel provided to the United States. As we've discussed in this call, this is, in fact, an intelligence failure on behalf of the Israelis, probably also in part on behalf of the U.S. intelligence community a little bit. But I would take that reporting, the Joint Chiefs of Staff assessment, with a big grain of salt, given those 2 caveats. That's it for me. Mr. Schwartz said, Emily, thank you very much. And, Josh, we'd now like to open this up to questions. Colleagues, thank you for that great introduction. And we will go to the line of Tracy Wilkerson with LA Times. Please go ahead. Thank you. Hi. Thank you for doing this interesting briefing. John, you said, you spoke of the future phase of diplomacy and the role of the Arab states in that, and I am curious whether you think that the U.S., given how forcefully the administration has sided with Israel, if the U.S. will still be, a viable partner in diplomacy with the Arab states, or if the Arab states are going to be sort of, I know no one is, a big fan of Hamas, but I wonder if some of those Arab states will be a little cautious to embrace the United States. the United States having embraced so forcefully Israel. And then just finally, Emily, you in passing after your very intelligence analysis, mentioned a possible U.S. intelligence failure in all of this, and I wondered if you could elaborate on that. Thank you. Dr. Alterman said, thank you, Tracy. You and I go way back, so it's a pleasure to talk to you again on the phone. Yeah, I think one of the important things to keep in mind is that all of the Arab governments, this is not talk about the Arab Street, which is different, but the Arab governments, completely share the Israelis' assessment of Hamas. They see Hamas as an armed group that embraces political Islam that grew out of the Muslim Brotherhood. That's one of the bogeymen of all the Arab regimes, right? And the other is they see Hamas as a proxy of Iran, their second bogeyman. So from a government perspective, the Arab governments have a keen interest in trying to help create a situation in Gaza where Hamas is pushed from power. But there's a legitimacy problem. You certainly can impose that solution from outside, but would they like to facilitate it? I think they would like to facilitate it, and that's where the opportunity comes. Certainly, as we've talked about, some of the images coming out of this war can make things impossible. We'll have to see where this all goes. But I think the instinct of governments is if they can be helpful pushing Hamas from power, they'd like that. One other thing just to point out that I neglected to say in my comments, I think Hamas was much more successful than it expected to be on Saturday, and I think they were much more successful than they should have been for their own good. One of the interesting things, in Dan's comments, Dan and I also go way back, one of the interesting things in Dan's comments is he said having 150 hostages in some ways gives you less leverage than having 1 or 2 hostages. I don't think they anticipated having 100 or 150 hostages. I don't think they anticipated being able to breach the border in 29 places. I don't think they anticipated that they were going to kill hundreds and hundreds of Israelis. That creates different outcomes. Hamas, I think, wanted to have the kind of victory that Egypt had in 1973 when Egypt, the principal victory for the Egyptian army, was merely crossing into Sinai, breaking through the Israeli defenses. 50 years later, the Egyptian army still considers 1973 to be their principal victory. And a couple weeks after they crossed into Sinai, they were beaten back within 100 kilometers of Cairo. But because Hamas penetrated that far into Israel, killed so many Israelis, kidnapped so many Israelis and others, I think it changes the possibilities for what the settlement of this war is going to look like, and I think not to the advantage of Hamas. Dr. Alterman said, Emily, there's a question for you there, too. Ms. Harding said, and then too, this is Emily. Yeah. To answer your question about U.S. intelligence failure, as much as I hate to call out my former brothers and sisters in the intelligence community, yeah, I think they are going to have to be doing some self-analyzation, some evaluation of previous intelligence pieces, and what they knew and when they knew it, and what they wrote and when they wrote it. Intelligence sharing between the U.S. and Israel really is a shared responsibility. In a lot of ways, there are places that the Israelis just know better and do better, and so the U.S. leans pretty heavily on them for information. Conversely, there are some things that the U.S. can do that we can share back with the Israelis. But when it comes to on-the-ground information, it's much more an Israeli show than it is a U.S. show. That said, there's plenty of information out there. It will be really interesting to see what the U.S. intelligence community comes back with as far as why this strategic surprise happened. Mr. Rule said, Emily, may I add to that wise comment? This is Norm. Ms. Harding said, yeah, of course, Norm. Go ahead. You know this quite as well as I do. Mr. Rule said, so I agree with everything you said. I would like to expand that just a little bit and say this is an international intelligence failure. The United States has looked at the Palestinians as a terrorist threat since the 1970s. We have had robust intelligence collections over the programs over the years against this threat. But you move resources to the assignment or target where you perceive there to be the greatest threat. And if you develop a sense that this isn't the most important thing, or you're not going to have the same number of personnel and focus that you had when aircraft were being hijacked so frequently. But the United Kingdom has the same responsibility. and neither the United States or the United Kingdom allow Israel to take over the intelligence collection protective responsibilities for our own citizens in their country. But Egypt also has a responsibility and has an intelligence service that looks at the Gaza issue. Now, there's been a report that Egypt may have acquired information and shared it with the Israelis. I think it's very unlikely or not a significant report, because if the Egyptians had an inkling that something like this were happening, they would have shared it with a lot of governments very loudly because of the consequences to the Sinai and Egyptian equities. Last, it shouldn't be forgotten that the Qatari State Security Service has a responsibility to monitor the Hamas political leadership in Doha. So I think, pulling back from this, you're going to see a number of intelligence services may have had a very particular paradigm of Hamas that shaped how they pursued this issue. And it's easy to say that Israel got it wrong, because they did, but so many other very serious actors, sober, thinking counter-terrorist professionals, really were in the same boat. Dr. Alterman said, let me jump the queue and ask you a question. Are you confident that the Hamas political leadership in Doha knew that? Or the Hamas political leadership in Lebanon knew that this was going to happen? Mr. Rule said, no. Dr. Alterman said, in terms of operational security and the way they were able to surprise the Israelis? Mr. Rule said, no, but that's a question that should be addressed in an intelligence hotwash of this issue. And I can't rule it out that they at least had some sort of knowledge that something was happening so that they could prepare political statements, that they could prepare the aftermath, prepare for their own safety and security in the aftermath of this event. So I can't prove a negative, but what I can say is they are not isolated actors in this event. And all the various regional players need to focus on a terrorist organization. That's the basic rule of thumb, and we don't release political actors from such focus. Ms. Harding said, yeah. This is Emily. I think that I'm totally glad that you brought up some of the regional actors and the shared responsibility there, Norm, because it's absolutely true. I think we have to look at both what seems to be dramatically improved Hamas operational security. I mean, the fact that an operation this big, that involved this many groups and this many people, did not leak in a more direct way is really kind of astonishing. But then also, from the other side of things, I think we have to look very carefully at just how these parties were sharing information. This is probably going to be one of those incidents where everybody was expecting Hamas to do kind of lowboil things, to do things like exercise, there to be a low level of chatter, so you see one data point, you dismiss it. Why did nobody put all the data points together and realize that, wait a second, this exercise looking at taking over a kibbutz looks a little bit like this conversation that may have happened over here, and why are they having this conversation on a line where they think we might be listening? So looking at all of those pieces put together is a really challenging intelligence question, but it's one that you absolutely have to do. And we will go to the line of Barbara Usher with BBC. Please go ahead. Just in terms of what someone, I think it was Mr. Alterman, was saying that Hamas maybe had achieved more than it expected to, I see that one of the spokesmen, Abu Obaida, said exactly that, it achieved more than it had hoped for. But my question is different. I wanted to ask Mr. Alterman where you think this leads U.S. Mideast policy and whether it shows that the Biden administration's approach has been a failure. I'm interested that Blinken keeps talking about in a very binary way the two paths, you know, one is normalization in a path to stability and the other is nihilism. And, of course, not, obviously, that simple. And whether you think it was an indication, a failure of U.S. policy that they sort of dropped the ball on the Palestinians themselves. Dr. Alterman said, thank you for that question. It seems to me that from a question of U.S. diplomacy there's a limited amount the United States can do when neither the Israeli side nor the Palestinian side saw either an urgency or a necessity to move forward on diplomacy. From a diplomatic perspective, and I know an awful lot of diplomats, as do you, all of these crises are exactly what diplomats see as opportunities, because now there will be both an urgency and necessity perceived on both sides to change the outcomes here. So I'm not sure that any action by the Biden administration from 2021 to a week ago would have galvanized movement on Arab-Israeli issues. I don't think the Israelis were interested in it, and I don't think there was a Palestinian party that was interested, either the Palestinian Authority or Hamas, in Gaza. But the coming weeks and months are going to provide an awful lot of opportunities for diplomacy. As I talked about, you're also going to have polarization/alienation. There are going to be people who say this exactly proves that you can't make peace with those people. But from a perspective of diplomats never accept that. Diplomats argue that you have to move things in the right direction and deal with imperfect outcomes. And it seems to me that the moment for diplomacy is going to come, and what Secretary Blinken is doing in the Middle East now is planting the seeds of precisely that diplomacy. Mr. Schwartz said, "Josh, we'll take another." Operator said, "We'll go to the line of Jeff Selden with VOA." Please go ahead. 2 questions, if I may. First, how well prepared do you think Hamas is for the fight that's to come with Israel in Gaza? Can Hamas win? And with the Hamas endgame, what does that look like? And then, also, given the capabilities that were demonstrated by Hamas, the operational silence, the different platforms it used, its propaganda campaign that went along with this, is there a need for the US and the other countries you mentioned to start re-evaluating all of Iran's proxies for what they might be able to do? Is there a chance that the underestimation of some of these groups goes far beyond what we saw with Hamas? Thanks. Mr. Schwartz said, "Seth, do you want to take that?" Dr. Jones said, "Yes." "Yeah, this is Seth. I can start." Dan and I are actually working on a piece together which touches on some of this. I mean, just on the Hamas question, the urban terrain for anybody that has been to Gaza it's difficult terrain for any experienced military, including the IDF, to operate in, and so I think when you look at the actual urban terrain, you've got narrow alleys, you've got concrete buildings of different heights, you've got warrens. Hamas and actually other groups, we're talking a lot about Hamas, but there certainly are other groups operating in Gaza, including Palestinian Islamic Jihad. There will probably be civilians that pick up weapons and fight. They have an intimate knowledge of Gaza's streets and alleys, underground facilities, including tunnels, buildings. And so as IDF soldiers make their way through Gaza, they've got to have to deal with the improvised explosive devices, suicide bombers, anti-tank missiles, RPGs, drones that Hamas has some capabilities. But I do think, at least the early part of this fight, the Israeli intelligence collection capabilities and the fact that Gaza is entirely surrounded does mean that Hamas probably will lose a large number of its military leadership and political leadership that are currently in Gaza. Some may be able to hide effectively, but I think we'll see Hamas take extremely heavy casualties. Over the midterm, I think the question gets back to this broader political issue is, to what degree does the fighting increase recruitment for groups that operate in Gaza, including ones that would turn to Hamas or Islamic Jihad or other organizations? So how does that play out in this sort of midterm? And that, I think, is an open question that we'll have to see how the combat goes. Just one other thing on the intelligence failures. When I was in Israel back in July and talked to senior IDF officials, I think one question that I think the Israelis, the Americans, the Gulf states, Norm, I think, rightly raised this, is, to what degree was there also bias on a focus on Hezbollah up in the north, as well as activity in the West Bank? There were operations in the summer that the Israelis were conducting in Jenin, for example. I heard generally from IDF deep concerns with the protests in Israel about their concerns about a Hezbollah ground invasion or ground attempted invasion from the north. So to what degree would that biasing judgments? That will be an interesting question. It sounds like Dan wanted to jump in on this as well. Dr. Byman said, "Seth, you summarized it well. Only thing I would say is, given the surprise Israel experienced with regard to the wide-ranging successful Hamas operation into Israel, it's clear that Hamas would have anticipated Israeli response into Gaza itself, so they are prepped and ready. So I would say it's two prepared forces clashing in exceptionally difficult terrain. I do think Israel has, in general, superiority, but it's going to be a tough fight." Hi there. Thanks for doing this call. I just have 2 quick questions, if I could. First, I'm curious, obviously, we've seen former President Trump weigh in on this, and President Biden, obviously, has been very focused on this. I'm curious if anyone could speak to, politically, how this factors into the 2024 race and U.S. politics. And then, additionally, I'm curious if any of you expect to see the Biden administration or the U.S. officials potentially increase pressure or be more outspoken about Israel's need to show restraint in its response to all this. Just curious what you all expect to see in terms of the Biden administration's role in sort of the humanitarian concerns and some of those that have been bubbling up as Israel prepares for its response to all this. Thank you. Mr. Schwartz said, John, do you want to take that? Dr. Alterman said, sure. I mean, I think it's hard to tell exactly what's going to happen politically before we understand what's happening militarily. I think we're going to have some surprises over the next several weeks. And I wouldn't want to prejudge them. I think the Biden administration's strong instinct, led by the president, is if you want to have influence with the Israelis, there are some rules. One is you have to show them empathy early. And every American president dating back to Carter who hasn't been very good at empathy has had problems with the Israelis. And everyone who has been good at showing empathy has had good relationships with the Israelis. So what we've seen out of the Biden administration is the president, in particular, trying to keep Benjamin Netanyahu very close, with the purpose that when you need to have influence down the road you need to have that foundation of trust. This administration is going to be very reluctant to criticize the Israelis publicly. I don't think you're going to see this, concerns being communicated over Twitter. What you see publicly, I think, is after things have been communicated for days strongly and privately. And to the extent the administration can keep its concerns private, it will, partly to reassure the Israelis. But the downside of that, and we talked a little bit about European attitudes and Arab attitudes, the downside is a sense the US is doing nothing and sitting on its hands while the rest of the world is seeking to pressure Israel. And why is the US not joining? President Biden in particular, who has seen himself as a Zionist, pro-Israeli for half a century, has been dealing with Benjamin Netanyahu I think more than any other global leader, because he and Netanyahu have been active in politics for literally, I think, for decades they've known each other. I think Biden will be willing to take that hit because he thinks that it serves the policy objective of moving Israeli policy. Dr. Jones said, yeah, can I jump in for 1 second? Just briefly, I think it's sort of an interesting question. The answer depends, I think, and the political dimensions may depend, in part, on how long the war lasts, the casualty build, how far this spreads. Does it spread to the West Bank? Does it spread within Israel itself, with civil strife? Doesn't spread north, not just to Lebanon but to Iranian actors in Syria or Iraq? All of which have standoff capabilities that can reach Israel or Yemen, as Norm raised. So I think there are a range of questions that will impact the political dimension. We're very early in this. And if you look at the casualty numbers, it's both sides. The Israelis suffered during the Second Intifada, just over 300 IDF soldiers dead, roughly. During Protective Edge, just under 100. But the casualties on the Palestinian side have been in the thousands. This war is likely to be more significant and brutal, based on what's just happened in Israel. So as we see casualties mount on both sides, including civilians, this will, I think, put pressure on political actors outside of Israel to try to keep those numbers down as much as possible. But there are a range of questions like, how long does it last, how far does it spread, that I think will impact. And we're still very early on, as John noted. Mr. Schwartz said, terrific. Thank you, Seth. Oh, thank you very much. Just a couple of quick questions on the hostage situation. I heard what you said, Daniel, that the rules may have changed. I think what you were essentially saying is they might have to accept some level of collateral damage there. Where does that leave the U.S.? What options are left for the U.S., obviously, under also a lot of pressure to get citizens it suspects of being held out? And which regional actors might play a role there? I heard Norm talk about Iran, but presumably that's not an option for the U.S. So which regional actors can the U.S. look to? Dr. Byman said, so this is going to be a huge question. And in a way, that, in my view, at least, the media storm about this has not begun. we're going to start to see live video released of individuals pleading for bombing halts because they feel threatened. We'll see family members that are understandably tremendously concerned about the safety of their loved ones. And that will increase political pressure on the Biden administration. I think the countries that are most likely to be of assistance to the United States in this are Qatar and Egypt, Qatar and Turkey, where they both have provided various forms of support to Hamas in the past but also have good, if far from perfect, relations with the United States. So they are potential go-between on hostage issues. Egypt in the past has played a role in negotiations as well, but Egypt itself is in a difficult situation. And I want to go back to a point that John said about unexpected consequences. I'm not sure Hamas thought, hey, we're going to do a massive operation and we'll get a bunch of American hostages. I think they basically rounded up whoever was there, and some of them happened to be Americans either visiting or, in many cases, dual citizens. So this is something that Hamas may not want. And may actually be moments when they do goodwill gestures, releasing children and the elderly. And other nationalities may come into play here as well. The Biden administration has said that it might request supplemental funding from Congress next week regarding Israel. Could you guys preview at all what you might expect to see in such a package? Thank you. Mr. Schwartz said, Emily, do you want to take that one? Ms. Harding said, sure. I'll start off, and I might hand it off to Seth to talk about what particular weapon systems the Israelis might want more of or be asking for here. I mean, Congress seems that it is poised to provide Israel a lot of what they want and what they need, even if it's a way of signaling support more than giving them precisely the equipment that they need. I guarantee there will be conversations behind the scenes about opening up any taps of intelligence that we have. We've already seen them move a carrier strike group into the Mediterranean over closer to Israel. I'm sure there is a deterrent mechanism and then also as a way to provide ISR if needed. But, Seth, I would ask you to talk about specific weapons systems. Dr. Jones said, yeah. Good question. I know there's been a lot of debate about types of weapons systems. If you look at what the Israelis are likely to use in Gaza, there's, I think, going to be a premium on precision weapons, particularly ones coming from air assets. The Israelis fly an F-15 and F-16s, including F-15 and F-16Is. They also fly drones that will shoot U.S.-manufactured missiles, including the Hellfires. So munitions, I think, is key. Also on the air defense side, particularly if we see additional Hamas firing rockets, or if this expands to include the West Bank and some of the Northern Territory, air defense capabilities for Iron Dome and other Israeli air defense systems, and possibly also small arms that Israel might need. I mean, Israel's got a lot. I think the question is also for deterrent purposes. The more that Israel goes through in Gaza, it wants to have sufficient stockpiles for deterrence purposes directed at the Syrians and the Lebanese, and at Hezbollah operating there, as well as in the West Bank. So there's a short-term need for weapons system for current operations, as well as for deterrence purposes to keep this from spreading. And the U.S. has already started sending in aircraft with the range of these kinds of weapons systems. Ms. Harding said, I would just add to that, this is Emily, again. I would just add to that as well that there will be debates on the Hill, or at least vocal opposition on the Hill. Folks saying that we can't keep supporting Ukraine and support Israel. I would go ahead and throw a flag on that and just say that there's no reason whatsoever that our support to Ukraine should be influenced by support that we are handing to Israel. It's just a different circumstance. And, as Seth rightly points out, Israel already has a lot of what it needs here. So that I think it's a red herring to say that we're going to shift all of our support for Ukraine over to Israel because we have to do that. Dr. Jones said, this is Seth again. Exclamation point on that. The weapons system that the U.S. is providing to Israel in general are not the ones, for the most part, U.S. is providing to Ukraine. Javelins, Adams, Excalibur, GMLRS. That's what we're providing to Ukraine, and obviously others. I don't think there's any expectation that any of those will go to the Israelis.